all your stuff. What can figure it out? That's how it chooses you.
Hello.
Hello, I'm trying a new setup because I decided I didn't want to stand up. I love all of you, but the standing has become a problem. I need more sitting in my life.
We love you a sitting amount, not a standing amount.
That's right.
Which I feel is appropriate.
Yeah, we don't really know each other. I mean, you know a shocking amount about both Claire and I and our childhood and parental relationships, but we haven't had a dinner party. I would stand if I was presenting to someone, like at a conference of colleagues or something, or giving a toast at a rehearsal dinner. These are the kinds of people you stand for.
The standing occasions.
Yes. But not having coffee, man.
Coffee is essential.
God. Yes.
And, you know, I'm addicted to it and I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
I decided a long time ago, let's just do this.
This is the one you chose. You're like, all the others, you know, I'll watch my relationship with them and see what it's giving me. But coffee, I'm just going to be addicted to and not consider why. Yeah, it's reasonable.
Should I send you some coffee?
I feel like I could buy coffee. It just seems like such a big deal. I don't know why. I have the money to buy coffee. Because I'd have to go to the grocery store that I just quit, and I don't want to have 17,000 conversations about why I don't work there anymore. It's part of the reason I left, is those people are all so fucking friendly, and it's just too many people to be beholden to emotionally. This is why I cut off emotional contact so quickly. It's because I get emotionally involved almost immediately upon meeting someone and then feel like I have to respond to them even though I really don't. And so I stopped going to the grocery store to get coffee because I don't want to have a conversation. Oh, Lord have mercy. How are you? How's your week been?
I'm doing well. We started gardening this week, which came upon me sudden-like. 2 weeks ago, no, I wasn't ready. And I think it's because there's this beautiful shift in the weather. It's been gorgeous. And suddenly I wanted to do it, which is great. It wasn't a stressful, like, oh, we got a plan and, you know, we're just doing it. So that's been wonderful. I've been outside a lot. I'm incredibly sore from doing practically nothing, of course.
Yeah, it's the good stuff.
So it's been good. I'm already encountering my own negativity in it, though. It's pretty funny. Like day 2, which was yesterday, I was like, fuck. Is this even going to work?
Isn't that fun?
It's an interesting thing. My negativity doesn't come out in a lot of places, but sometimes I just feel so hopeless, you know?
It requires a lot of faith, planting a garden on the windswept prairies of Colorado.
Yeah, and I feel really faithful when I do it. But I also feel like I might just be stupid.
Yeah.
And so it makes me feel really human, which is good because I do have a tendency on occasion to think I'm better than
being human's not good. No, yeah. What are you talking about? Oh, everybody does it. Is that a reason for me to feel okay about doing this bullshit? Just that everybody does it? No. Come on. Let's try and, you know, adhere to a slightly higher standard, maybe, than human. Yeah, no.
Claire Patton, slightly better than human.
Slightly better than human. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the weather change has definitely affected me. I have ants in my pants, for sure. Like always wanting to walk or be outside or do something and not willing to wait for anyone to finish a sentence, or just a weird feeling of impatience. I tend to think of myself as a patient person, but I'm not right now. Like, it needs to be done now. You have to finish it now. Everything is now.
I get that, and I think that comes out in my gardening, too. I'm a very patient person in general. But with gardening, I'm like, why aren't you growing? Why aren't you growing? Why aren't you growing? Why isn't this fixed? Why blah, blah, blah.
Make a tomato, for God's sake. You've been in the ground for months. Make a tomato. I saw your flowers. You had flowers. Make a tomato.
We were laughing yesterday because our cohorts out here were clearing their garden out for some spring planting, and they found some beets that we're finally full size after a year. And I was like, can I tell you how many things I've grown that for some reason have taken a full year? That happens to me all the time where I'm like, oh, here's that thing.
I did plant potatoes here. Oh.
I don't know if I'm a really bad gardener or just a really slow gardener. We're just on the annual plan.
Yeah. I love that they found beets, though. I bet they're sweet.
Yeah, well, they didn't have any tops, so that's why they didn't know they were there. So we'll see.
They've just been storing energy underground, just waiting. We're here, you guys.
Yeah.
You want something sweet and full of iron? That's us. Give us a call. And then finally they're like, oh my God, there's a shovel. Life is so good. Doing like Beatles crazy teen girl hands. Oh my God, we get to be in salad now. Oh my God, life is so good.
The Beatles.
Oh, see, I didn't even mean it. That was unintentional.
That's how good you are.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but thank you. I was just really enjoying the idea of beets, because beets are very sort of austere. To me, they seem like a very serious vegetable, and I very much liked comparing them to those crazy Beatlemania girls.
They have gravitas, the beets. It's the iron.
They're basically metal. When you're just basically eating metal. That's why they're good for you, because we need metal. That's nutrition, right?
100% nutrition. This is the podcast. It chooses you.
So it is.
I am Claire Patton.
I'm Teresa Sparks.
We remain Claire Patton and Teresa Sparks.
We're always going to be us. It's never going to be anyone else. We talk about things we enjoy, or things we find amusing, or things we find ridiculous or disturbing, or just things we enjoy talking about, which could be anything. Best of luck to you. The title says it. Okay, just look. Look at the titles. That's how you can tell what we're going to talk about.
And today's story is all of the above. Hey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and most importantly, download our episodes.
Yes, please, and thank you. Our dear friend Jeffrey, who you all feel like you know, because you do, because he's amazing, and we talk about him all the time. He realized that he'd listened to everything, and he was so sad that he was caught up, and now he had to wait for it. And then he's like, oh, and I'd never downloaded an episode. I've been listening to you guys, but I've just been listening to it without downloading it. So let me go back and do that. I was like, thanks, Jeffrey. Cool. So it's never too late, is my point. If you've listened to all of us and you just feel like helping, just download them all, but then you can delete them right away if you've already heard them. You don't got to hang on to them.
Yeah.
Just demonstrate to the algorithm that you listened. That's all.
Marie Kondo that shit. Let it give you joy and then release it.
Then let it go into the world. That's right.
So today, Central Podcast Time is what I'm calling it.
It is a perfect name for it.
Today, Central Podcast Time is the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic.
Oh, okay.
April 14th, 1912 is when it hit the iceberg. April 15th, 1912, just a few hours later, wee hours of the morning, it actually sunk beneath the waves.
So, guys, spoiler alert. If you don't know the story of the Titanic, don't listen.
Maybe watch the movie Titanic and get back to us.
And the thing you think about the door at the end being big enough for both of them, yeah, everybody thinks that. So now that you know that, just come on back. Yeah.
So I was recently playing a video game. It's sort of an escape room video game, puzzly. It's an imperfect game, though I had a lot of fun with it. It's called the Nonnery Games. It's a series. The one I played is called 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. And in that game, they did a really great job of creating lore around this mysterious and creepy scenario that your character wakes up and finds themselves in and has to escape from. I won't get too deep into the game, but basically, throughout the course of the game, they were dropping all this information about Titanic conspiracy theories. And I was like, wow, how fascinating. So we are going to talk about conspiracy theories, but what happened to me was that I thought I knew the story of the Titanic, and I got into it, and there are just some fascinating sidelights to the main story that I enjoyed hearing about, and I thought our listeners and you might enjoy hearing about. So we're talking Titanic Lost and Found today, but I hope that I'll be imparting some information that most people don't know about the story that we're all very familiar with.
Awesome. I'm very, very excited to hear.
My sources, get ready.
Life is my source. Look around you.
Beauty is my source. Wikipedia is my source. Lots of Wikipedia. Thank you, Wikipedia. There were 2 articles from businessinsider.com, weirdly enough, that were very helpful. allthat'sinteresting.com, the YouTube channel by Simon Whistler, who does biographics. I love him. He has another channel. He has several other channels, but he has one called Mega Projects where he talks about these kind of crazy undertakings. So he has a video called Olympic Class Ocean Liners on mega projects. History.com, several articles, nationalgeographic.com, of course, bbc.com, and the blog A Titanic Conspiracy Reader. Oh yeah, we went there.
Oh my God. Amazing. Okay.
We are at some point going to get into conspiracy theories. I will be very clear about that. That stuff is obviously not factual. That's just speculation. So everyone will have to kind of investigate on their own and see what they choose to believe with regard to the conspiracy theories. I'm not going to decide for you, but I'll tell you what I think. They're all bullshit. All right. Spoiler alert.
You just gave a spoiler after you gave a spoiler alert after you gave the spoiler. That's my favorite thing you've ever done. Thank you. I love you so much. I'm just overwhelmed with love for you right now. You make me so happy. Okay.
Thanks. I'm slightly better than human. The Titanic, the ocean liner, was owned by White Star Line, and it was part of a trio of Olympic-class ocean liners. So basically the Brits, White Star Line was a British company, the Brits were sort of in competition with the French to create these large ocean liners, and the Titanic was one of them. It was constructed in Belfast, Ireland, directly alongside its sister ship, the Olympic. So we've got the Titanic and the Olympic. Now, the Olympic became seaworthy before the Titanic did, so its seafaring career began earlier than the Titanic's. It was originally captained by Edward John Smith, who is famously the Titanic captain. The Olympic set sail. Her first few voyages go fine, but on her 5th voyage under Edward John Smith's captaining,
Yes.
on her 5th voyage in 1911, under Captain Edward Smith's captaining.
I'm sorry. I definitely want you to call it captaining, for sure. But if you are looking for the word, I think command is the word you're looking for. But please continue to say captain.
I'm sorry. What made you think I was looking for another word? On the Olympic's 5th voyage in 1911, it collided with the HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight. So what happened was both ships were sort of running parallel to each other, and for some reason the Olympic just started turning into the Hawke. Now, nobody died in that, and the Olympic was actually had some pretty extensive damage, but it was able to limp back to the harbor at Southampton, England. Eventually, an inquest was launched and found the White Star Line 100% liable for the damage.
Well, yeah. And that's the same captain, right? So now we know he has a track record of just randomly hitting shit in the ocean. It's not the first time. Yeah.
This did strike me as significant. I will also say he had a 40-year career before that in which literally nothing happened. So he had a pretty good track record before that. The 3rd Olympic-class ocean liner belonging to White Star came along a little bit later. It was called the Britannic. And it was launched actually in 1915, 3 years after the Titanic went down. And it was obviously designed to be a passenger cruiser, but it launched right as World War I broke out. So rather than ever being a passenger ship, it was recruited as a hospital ship for the British Red Cross immediately. It sort of tooled around the world doing that. And in 1916, the Britannic hit a German deep sea mine near the Greek island of Kea. And she sank in 55 minutes.
Yeah.
The Britannic's sinking resulted in about 30 fatalities, which wasn't obviously as bad as the loss of life with the Titanic. Basically, after the Titanic sank, people were suddenly like, oh, there's like probably some safety stuff we should put in place, right?
That's a perfectly slightly more than human response.
Yeah.
Like, horrible things happen. Oh, maybe we should consider whether there are enough doors in this nightclub. Yeah.
Right.
Can people get out if there's a fire? No? Okay.
So just a few stats on the Titanic. 8 men died while constructing the Titanic. The Titanic weighed 45 to 48,000 tons.
I have no ability to make that mean anything. I don't know how many that is.
It's a lot of tons. And the Titanic had 9 decks, 7 of which were for passengers. And interestingly, it famously has those 4 smokestacks on there. The 4th smokestack didn't actually do anything. It was just for symmetry.
So it was built like a movie set.
Yeah. And they did end up making it vent for the kitchen, but I mean, they were like, why not?
We have this whole 4th smokestack, you guys. Is there nothing we can vent through this? They surveyed every department on ship, and finally the kitchen was like, our potato steam needs to go somewhere.
That's right. And there was a lot of potato steam on that ship. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic, the largest moving object in the world, supposedly unsinkable, left from Southampton, England for New York. It had around 2,200 souls on board. 4 days later, at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and in the early morning hours of April 15th, at about 2:20 a.m., the Titanic sank into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic.
Bye.
1,503 people died. There are around 700 survivors. The crew had been warned about icebergs in the area, so they're in the North Atlantic. They'd been warned about icebergs in the area by 6 different ships. So the captain, Edward Smith, ordered the engines at full steam, which was apparently pretty typical tactic back then. And I was trying to figure out, like, why would they go full steam when they're like, hey, there's a bunch of dangerous objects that you're going to have to maneuver around. And the only thing I could come up with is it's like the let's get the fuck out of here tactic. Like, I don't know. Let's make this quick, I guess.
Maybe they just needed the XP. They just needed to get through. They just had to do one run of the North Atlantic ice fields to get the XP, and they just were trying to get it over with.
I like that theory. This is the best theory about the Titanic I've ever heard. So this was pretty baffling to me. It turns out that for some reason, these ships' binoculars, and it sounded like there was one pair, were under lock and key. And the officer that held the keys to that cabinet where the binoculars were had actually been removed from service suddenly right before the Titanic left for New York. So he forgot to give the keys back. So the lookouts in the crow's nest of the Titanic had no binoculars.
They're just people up in the freezing cold darkness.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes open, though. Okay. Come on, Scott. Keep your eyes open.
Scott!
Damn it!
It was a clear night, but it's like, how are these dudes supposed to see the iceberg coming if they got no binoculars? There's several things here that I feel like, oh, if they just had done this or not done this stupid thing.
If they had just the tiniest amount of foresight or planning, or had just not been stupid in that one moment.
Right.
It would have all gone differently.
So crewman Frederick Fleet caught sight of the iceberg and notified the bridge. Shortly after, the crew tried to correct course to avoid the iceberg, but because the ship was going so fast, right, it had been ordered to go, it was, I think, going 23 knots, and the top speed was 25, so it was, like, really close to its top speed.
It was hauling ass.
Hauling Titanic ass. Although the crew tried to correct to avoid the iceberg, the Titanic sideswiped it while trying to turn away, ripping holes in its hull below the waterline. Basically what happened was the seams buckled. So it wasn't like the iceberg carved a hole in it. It's like the iceberg impacted the hull and the seams were like, I don't think we can do this.
They're like, finally, we didn't want to do this job anyway. We all quit.
Exactly. The pumps on the Titanic just couldn't compete with the sheer volume of water that was pouring in. The ship started sinking bow first. Famously, there were 20 lifeboats aboard the ship. The 20 lifeboats could hold about half the passengers on board. I will say the Titanic had space for 60 lifeboats. But the powers that be didn't want to, quote unquote, crowd the deck with so many lifeboats.
This is a pleasure cruise.
Yeah, people would walk around, right? So there were only 20. The lifeboat evacuations lasted about 2 hours, and in the chaos, some of the lifeboats that left more than 50% under their capacity.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like it's very clear that all these choices were made for the wealthy. Like, we don't want to have lifeboats cluttering up the deck that these incredibly wealthy people are going to promenade upon, right? And we have enough lifeboats to save the wealthy, so we're okay.
And throughout all of this, Captain Smith never issued an abandoned ship warning. So many of the passengers and even crew members didn't even know that there was anything wrong until it was way too late.
Oh my God. Yep.
There was a ship with about a 50-person crew nearby called the SS Californian. It was about 12 to 17 miles away, but the radio operator was asleep, so it didn't hear the Titanic's distress calls via radio, which they did send out. Then the Titanic sent off flares, but the crew of the SS Californian misinterpreted the flares, thinking they might have been stars. So they were far enough away, and it was a clear enough night that the crew of the Californian was looking at the horizon and going, are those flares or are those just blinking stars? Like, they couldn't tell. They didn't end up coming to the ship's aid. And each ship was trying to signal one another via Morse code on a lamp, but couldn't actually see. So they weren't able to see what the other ship was saying. So as it stands, the Californian would probably have taken an hour to get there. So it's unclear how much of a difference it would have made, because hypothermia does set in very quickly. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have tried. So there was an inquest afterwards, and they were all cleared of any wrongdoing. But it is, when you read about this part of the story, it's really confusing as to who knew what when and what was going on and why they didn't come to their aid. But apparently there was a lot of confusion. As the Titanic's deck sank below the water, the ocean poured in through windows, grates, and portholes, and the sinking accelerated. This caused the stern to rise out of the water, exposing the ship's propellers, and the ship ripped in half. The stern, still filled with air, stayed afloat for a few minutes and rose to an almost vertical angle, famously from the film, as hundreds of people clung to the ship.
Jesus.
How fucking terrifying. Finally, at 2:20 a.m., the entirety of the Titanic sank below the water, and lots of the people who survived the initial wreck died of hypothermia rather than drowning. All 25 engineers stayed behind on the ship to ensure that the power kept running, and all 25 of those engineers died. Captain Edward Smith went down with the ship. He was rumored to have been at the helm until it sank, but there are other reports of him in the water, saving a child and shouting orders from the ocean with no attempt to enter a lifeboat. Like, some people said, they were like, hey, you should get in this lifeboat. And he was like, no, I'm good. I don't know what's true. Again, people's memories change afterwards. It could have been another guy that looked like him,
Well, and he'd been sailing, you said, for 40 years or more at this point, right?
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, you're like, I figured I was probably going to die in the ocean, and it looks like this is how.
It seemed like that was his attitude. Like, he knew.
And all things considered, a relatively, I will just venture to say that being lit on fire is a more difficult way to die than slipping into the icy grip of freezing water.
Yep. Oddly, the sister ship, the Olympic, was about 560 miles away from the Titanic when it sank. It obviously could not have gotten there in time to make a difference, but they considered sending it there, but then the powers that be were like, maybe we don't want to ask the survivors to board a ship that is the exact twin of the ship that just sunk in the ocean. But, I would have taken anything at that point. Just get me out of this water.
That's right. It doesn't matter what it looks like. I don't care. Please, I'm cold. Yeah, I love this idea that one is named after the Titans and one is named after the Olympians, the children of the Titans. And so they're like, no, we're not sending the Olympians hate the Titans. That's not a relationship that's going to work out for anybody. We're not doing that.
So finally at 4:10 a.m., the Carpathia arrived on the scene and rescued the remaining survivors.
This is actually my favorite part of the story. It's my favorite part because, Carpathia is where Dracula's from. So basically Dracula saved the survivors of the Titanic. Yeah. I like that very much. It makes me very happy.
We've got the Olympians, we've got the Titans, and then suddenly we fanficked some Dracula in there. I love it.
That's right.
Okay, so now we're going to get into some weird stuff. This is like my favorite territory. There's a woman named Violet Jessup who was a stewardess on board the Titanic. Violet was born in Argentina to Irish immigrants. She was diagnosed during childhood with tuberculosis, and the doctors predicted she would die. And she didn't. Her father died when she was 16, and their family moved back to London. Her mother was a sea stewardess, so Violet cared for her younger siblings often while their mother was away. When Violet was around 21, her mother got too ill to work, so Violet took over as the breadwinner, becoming also a sea stewardess, just like her mom. In 1911, Violet was a stewardess on board the Olympic when it hit the HMS Hawke. On the 10th of April, 1912, she boarded the Titanic as a stewardess. During the sinking of the Titanic, she was asked to come above deck to serve as an example of what processes to go through and what to do to those passengers on board who didn't speak English. She was loaded into a lifeboat, and someone handed her a baby, just a random baby. Later, on board the Carpathia, a woman grabbed the baby from Violet crying and ran away. And Violet was like, well, I hope that's that kid's mom. During World War I, Violet became a stewardess for the British Red Cross and served on board the Britannic in 1916. She was on the Britannic when the Britannic hit the deep sea mine and sunk. So at this point, the cruise liners had kind of figured out that safety was a thing. So they were equipping the ships with adequate number of lifeboats. But in the case of the Britannic, the lifeboats were actually deployed too fast. And so several lifeboats were actually sucked into the propeller and under the stern of the ship. 30 people died in this explosion, and many of them were killed in the lifeboats.
Oh, God, they were full of people when they were sucked into the propeller. Oh, God.
Violet Jessup was in one of these lifeboats when it got sucked under the propeller, and she just fucking dove for it. She dove out. She survived. She sustained a head injury that troubled her for the rest of her life, but she survived. So Violet was on the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic.
So my conspiracy theory is that this is all her doing.
Well,
is she securing sacrifices for the gods of the sea? Is that what's happening right now? Like, what's her deal?
I was like, is she just cursed or what? It turns out there's another man named Arthur John Priest who was a stoker, so he was one of the ones stoking the coal fires. He, too, was on all 3 ships.
Oh, my God.
The thing about him is I'm like, he's at the bottom of the ship, right?
Yeah.
How the fuck did he survive 3 wrecks like that? And he actually survived 2 more afterwards.
Oh, my God.
So he had like 5 horribly fatal wrecks under his belt, and then he finally retired. There's not a lot known about him, so I didn't go too deep into his story.
You know why? It's because neither one of them actually exist. They're they're something less than human.
Right? They're not people, they're just curses.
I mean, that is very, very weird, though. That the same 2 people were on all 3 ships in the White Star Line at the time that they had their misadventures, let's say. That's very interesting.
And there was another guy who was on 2 of them. I don't, that's not researched at all. But, I mean, it's true.
You're just saying random things. Now is the part of the podcast where I just lie.
You know, the weird thing is there was this stale piece of pizza that was on all 3 ships.
And they're like, we don't even eat pizza. It's 1914.
Yeah.
What is this flatbread with sauce on it?
This is a tidbit that I find fascinating. That in 1898, so 14 years before the Titanic's wreck, a man named Morgan Robertson wrote a book called The Wreck of the Titan. It was about an oceanic cruiser named the Titan that was supposedly unsinkable, that hits an iceberg and sinks on a cold April night. And the Titan didn't have enough lifeboats for the entirety of its passengers. And the Titan, in terms of size and speed, was very similar to the Titanic.
Isn't that crazy?
So Morgan was still alive when the Titanic sank, and people were like, oh my God, you are so psychic. They really did. They said, oh my gosh, you're psychic. And he was like, no, I've just been on the sea my whole life and I understand naval trends. So it was just an educated guess as to what eventually was going to happen. I love that he was presented with the opportunity to claim some kind of powers and he didn't.
He's like, nah. Have you ever been on one of these things? They're floating death traps anyway.
That's exactly the kind of mind you need to be able to write something like that.
Or to run a fucking ship. Practical, interested in logistics, what things actually are. The gods of the sea never made it into any of his staff meetings. I'm going to tell you that right now.
No. I mean, he was like, Neptune, go to hell.
Tethys, fuck off.
Okay, let's get into some conspiracy theories. There are so many, and I'm just going to tell you my favorites. The first conspiracy theory is that the Titanic was actually taken out by a U-boat. Several survivors of the Titanic said they saw, quote, an unidentified vessel approximately 5 to 6 miles away from the Titanic as it sank. This vessel stayed around till about 2 a.m. and then left. And there are also some statements from survivors saying several explosions went off inside the ship at some point. So this gave rise to the theory that a German U-boat may have sunk the Titanic. I kind of wondered if maybe what people were seeing were the lights from the Californian, which was like 12 miles away. I don't know. A lot was going on.
Yeah, also, this seems to me to be a conspiracy born out of not understanding machinery.
Yeah.
She says in a way that makes it clear she, too, does not understand machinery. But, just because explosions happened inside doesn't mean there were explosives put inside. There are lots of things on a big device that can blow up if not properly aligned.
There's lots of things in there that can go boom. I don't understand them, but I know they're there. Another really popular conspiracy theory is that J.P. Morgan orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic.
To kill all the wealthy ones? To kill the Vanderbilts?
J.P. Morgan was actually scheduled he had booked passage on the Titanic, but he didn't show up. This gave rise to the conspiracy theory that he planned the sinking of the Titanic to get rid of his rivals, Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim, all of whom were on board and died.
I mean, that seems on brand for him.
The theories are prompted by the fact that his shipping trust controlled White Star Line. So there is a connection there. But it's a pretty elaborate plan to just kill off 3 or 4 other dudes, you know?
Yeah, especially when at a time when, a cut on your leg could kill you. You know, there are a lot of things medicine did not understand at the time. It seems to me there would be easier ways to deal with 3 or 4. Although maybe not in a way that would deflect suspicion from you, though, because there were 3 or 4 of them, but it was a boat full of 2,200 people. So it wasn't, who's to say if there was a target here? But also a giant iceberg, crew members saw a giant iceberg tear into the hull, right?
Right.
Okay. Just checking.
Unless you believe the iceberg was made out of, paper mache. Another conspiracy theory that's very popular is that because of the Olympics damages when it hit the HMS Hawk, that White Star Line wanted to get rid of it because the repairs made it not profitable. So the theory goes that rather than the Titanic that sailed that fateful journey, it was actually the Olympic masquerading as the Titanic. And that the company sank the ship for the insurance money, and the Titanic then took the Olympics' place for the rest of its marine career.
So they basically just scrape the paint name off of each of them and swap them?
Yeah. It also feels really far-fetched to me. The key piece of information here is that the Titanic's insurance was not enough to cover the loss of the Olympics. So it just doesn't work from the starting gate. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then the last conspiracy theory I'm going to tell you about is my favorite. There was a man on board the Titanic named William Stead who ended up dying. And he was a spiritualist and an English editor. And he had been spreading stories for years about how a cursed mummy from the British Museum had been killing people off in London. It was this whole elaborate series of deaths that occurred in relation to this contact with this mummy, supposedly. Basically, he spent the whole trip telling people about this curse. He was really fascinated by it. And as survivors repeated that story to the press, the story kind of spread and eventually turned into, oh my God, there was a mummy on board the Titanic. But this was also kind of reinforced by the fact that Margaret Brown, who's the unsinkable Molly Brown, she was on board and she had some Egyptian artifacts on board the ship that she was bringing home to the Denver Museum, including a mummified figurine that she had in her coat pocket when the accident happened. And she ended up gifting it to the captain of the Carpathia as a thank you. So some people believe the mummy was actually on board and actually caused the ship to sink. There doesn't really seem to be any evidence for that, but...
How does a wealthy American woman come to have a tiny mummy in her pocket in the first place?
She had gone to Cairo. So it was, it was a figurine,
Okay,
It wasn't a mummy. They said a mummified figurine, which I assume means that they pulled it out of a tomb somewhere.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Stole from the Egyptian people, basically.
That's right. Colonizer's delight. Give me all your stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was just a figurine. I could see where those signals could, I've seen pictures of it. It looks like a little mummy.
Okay, so that conspiracy theory is that maybe the curse of the mummy actually sank the Titanic.
Yeah, and it turns out that the British Museum didn't even have a mummy. They just had the sarcophagus.
Oh, it turns out to entirely be nonsense. Oh, okay.
There are theories that, someone wealthy wanted to get rid of it because it was cursed, and so they were selling it in America, and it was shipped on the it's just a whole thing. Now we're going to fast forward a few years, and we're going to talk about the finding of the location of the Titanic.
Yes.
So over the years, many, many people sought to find the wreck site of the Titanic, but the wreckage had drifted a bit, so people weren't able to find it. I think it was probably generally known that it might be in this area, but no one had actually been able to locate it. So now we're going to talk about Robert Ballard. A man near and dear to my heart. I really love him, and I'll explain why. Robert Ballard, for anyone who doesn't know, is an underwater archaeologist, which is so badass. The underwater version of Indiana Jones.
It's a very specific career. You don't fall into that one. You really got to chase that one down.
Yeah, I think so. He is also professor of oceanography. He was born on June 30th, 1942, and grew up in San Diego. His interest in oceanography was inspired from a young age by Jules Verne's
Nice.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
What's up, Julie?
Hi, Jules. And also because he grew up near the ocean, of course.
Sure, San Diego. I mean, classic.
Bob studied chemistry and geology as an undergrad at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He joined the ROTC and obtained an officer's commission in Army intelligence. He got a graduate degree in geophysics, and he was studying for a graduate diploma in marine geology when he was called to active duty. So when that happened, he requested a transfer to the Navy, which was approved. So he worked for the Navy as an oceanographer. In 1969, he embarked on his first underwater dive in a submersible. So he was kind of fascinated with submersibles from a young age, which, I mean, who isn't?
Who isn't? Yeah.
Basically now his job becomes just embarking on these various diving missions, and sometimes he would serve as a geologist, a consulting geologist on these expeditions. In 1977, he was part of a team that discovered hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. So this was a huge deal, because until then it was believed that all life on the planet needed the sun to live and needed a very specific temperature range.
He changed the course of science.
He did, because they discovered, he and his team, there was a group of people, but they discovered that a complex ecosystem could thrive in total darkness, being sustained by the energy directly emitted from the Earth. He says that it explains how life originated in the ocean, which scientists had always kind of wondered how that worked. I am fascinated by it, and you'll find out why.
Okay.
Bob Ballard is a big advocate for, he's like, let's go to space, sure, but like we haven't even fully understand the ocean. I saw his TED Talk, he had a TED Talk from like 8 years ago, and don't quote me on this, but he said that we've explored something like 20% of the ocean. I think it's fascinating when I see something new that's real and on this planet, and I'm like, what the hell? Bob Ballard's work for the Navy involved developing these submersibles that could travel to great depths in the ocean as they were unmanned and could be controlled from the ship above. Early on in 1973, he saw this as a way that the Titanic could be found. Ballard developed a submersible called Argo. It was an underwater sled with cameras on it, and the sled was towed behind a ship. Argo could reach depths of 20,000 feet, and this was significant because it meant he could reach 98% of the world's ocean floor with this one submersible.
Amazing.
It was 15 feet long, 3.5 feet tall and wide, but it weighed 4,000 pounds. It had cameras pointed all around, below, above, and those cameras could zoom, and obviously it had lights to illuminate the ocean floor because at that depth it can be really dark. So in the summer of 1985, he was part of a team. It was a collaboration with a French team that was searching for the Titanic using sonar. But that ship got recalled to France. So I'm realizing how much connection there actually is between the military and oceanographic institutes. Often these ships are military. The ship was recalled to France, so he got a new ship to search for the Titanic, the RV Nor. What almost no one except Ballard knew at the time was that the entire mission was paid for by the U.S. Navy, and it was a top secret mission. So here's what happened. Back in 1982, Ballard had contacted the Navy to see if they were interested in his Titanic project, and they were like, no way. We don't care about the Titanic. The Navy basically said, okay, look, we'll pay for your little Titanic thing, but we need you to do us a solid and try and find a couple of subs we've lost over the years. Just take a look and make sure they're not like leaking plutonium into the ocean. But, and this is key, be cool about it. We don't want people to know.
Also, there might be some stolen Nazi gold on those subs, and we would very much like to have that back if possible.
Right.
So it might be, quote, repatriated.
They funded his trip to go look for these 2 submarines, and they gave him the Nor, gave him a ship and everything. And they were like, if you find these submarines and you complete these missions, and you keep your mouth shut, if you have any time with the ship left over and any money, you can go do your little Titanic thing. He searched for and found both the USS Scorpion and the USS Thresher.
In a single day. He's like, okay, listen, I'm going North Atlantic now. See ya.
These are both nuclear-powered submarines that had been lost since the 1960s. Ballard was in a precarious position, though, because the mission was top secret, but he had this French team on board, and he also had a National Geographic cameraman on board, and he wasn't allowed to tell them what he was doing. So he said he had to cross his fingers and hope no one noticed what he was actually doing, and they apparently didn't. No one questioned him. I could see with the cameraman, right? He's like, I don't know what they're doing. It's fucking science-y, right?
Is there anything for me to point this at?
Yeah, the French team had to be kind of wise to like, oh, why are we stopped here? What's interesting is that up until then, the method for finding crash sites was called mowing the lawn, which was basically systematically going back and forth in a small area trying to find wreckage. And they were using the Argo to do this, so they were towing the Argo behind. In this case, both subs had actually imploded at that depth, so there was debris leading to both crash sites. And by locating that debris, they could be more efficient in finding the crash sites since they could extend a mile out from the main rat. In this way, they were able to find both the submarine crash sites where everything seemed to be fine in terms of nuclear contamination. After locating and investigating the 2 crash sites, Ballard only had 12 days left on his timeline with the Navy.
Mm-hmm. Dun, dun, dun!
As I said, they had discovered this more efficient method for searching. So he was able to work in a larger area and in a wider pattern. So they basically dragged Argo behind the ship, and Argo transmitted back video footage and data that was analyzed and monitored 24 hours a day. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1985, Argo noted some irregularities in the ocean floor. It was pocked from impacts, and soon after, Ballard and the entire crew were awakened as the Titanic's boiler was spotted. The crew erupted in cheers, and someone opened a bottle of champagne. And then they all realized that was almost 2:20 a.m., the time that the Titanic finally had sunk under the ocean. Bob Ballard later said, "We were embarrassed, we were celebrating." He said this on 60 Minutes. And all of a sudden, we realized that we should not be dancing on someone's grave.
Yeah, I love that.
They were able to follow this debris trail to the hull of the Titanic. And their investigation at the time focused on just the exterior of the ship. You know, they mainly just wanted to find it. They drove the Argo around, and then they were able to confirm that the ship was split in half. That was something that was controversial at the time, or it had been debated at the time. Argo, and there was another smaller submersible called Angus. Argo and Angus captured photos of the hull and mast, the crow's nest. There was a skylight missing that allowed them to peer down into the ship at where the grand staircase had been. The debris around the wreck site included china, furniture, and unopened cases of champagne. The human remains were long gone, having been eaten by sea life, but eerily, the ocean floor was littered with the passengers' shoes.
Yeah.
Bob later wrote, quote, "It was one thing to have won, to have found that ship. It was another thing to be there. That was the spooky part. I could see the Titanic as she slipped nose first into the glassy water. Around me were the ghostly shapes of the lifeboats and the piercing shouts and screams of people freezing to death in the water," end quote. The crew of the Nor remained at the site for 4 days before storms forced them to return to Massachusetts. In the summer of '86, the next year, Ballard returned on board the Atlantis II, and using Jason Jr., a small submersible that could get inside the wreck, he got some more detailed images. He also was able to travel down to the wreckage himself on the submersible Alvin, which was a manned submersible. Ballard went on to locate the wreckage of the Bismarck off the coast of France and investigated the site of the Lusitania's demise off the coast of Ireland as well. Oh, he also discovered the crash site of JFK's PT-109, which was a small patrol torpedo boat which was rammed by a Japanese destroyer during World War II and sank near the Solomon Islands. That's a whole other crazy story. Ballard spent the rest of his career just having adventures as a maritime, I almost said astrologist, as a maritime archaeologist. In 1989, Robert Ballard started the Jason Project. It was a curriculum for middle school students to get them interested in the math, technology, and the sciences. I was actually a part of this program when I was in middle school. And I remember that our class traveled to visit with Ballard on what was, like Zoom now, it was video conferencing, and ask him questions. And they did a live feed with Jason on the ocean floor near these hydrothermic vents.
That's cool.
Leading into that, we did all this research on him and learned about him and his career and his discoveries. And he just was oddly a big part of my middle school experience. Now, obviously, the program did not draw me to the sciences, but it's something really memorable that gives him a special place in my heart. In 2002, he became a professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. He's also the director of the Institute for Archaeological Oceanography. In his first press conference after finding the Titanic, Ballard said, quote, "The Titanic lies now in 13,000 feet of water on a gently sloping alpine-like countryside, overlooking a small canyon below. There is no light at this great depth, and little life can be found. It is a quiet and peaceful place, and a fitting place for the remains of this greatest of sea tragedies to rest. Forever may it remain that way," end quote. He was actually really opposed to anyone taking anything from the site because he considered it a cemetery.
And rightly so, I think. I admit that my sensitivity to the deaths of all of those people wanes when I know that many of them would be long dead by natural causes by now. The historical distance really helps me. If we're talking about something more recent than happened, that's a little more raw. But I get where he's coming from.
I just appreciate that.
It shows, I think, one more way in which he's deeply respectful.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people that want to capitalize off that story. Sunken treasure and that. I mean, hey, come on, I love treasure. I did a whole episode about it.
It seems like it's a pretty short leap from let's, see if there's anything we can salvage to dinner plates from the Titanic being for sale on eBay. It seems like a very short number of steps between those two things, and I get him not even wanting to go down that direction.
And I guess it's just that, if people are going to investigate this sort of thing, he's the type of person you want to investigate it, right? Someone who's going to be respectful and on some level be sensitive to the loss of human life. But I agree with you that there is something in the fact that it took place so long ago that does keep us from feeling that weight of loss of human life. But geez, 1,500 people. That's a lot of people.
1,500 people and, passengers in second class and steerage were locked in the bottom of the boat.
So that's actually not necessarily true.
Interesting.
This sort of famous moment from the Titanic movie where they close the gates and lock the lower class passengers. There's actually no historical evidence for that. There were gates, which was an immigration thing, because they were coming to New York, but there's no evidence that they locked them in there. I think it's just God, I hope they didn't. That's
interesting. I'm sure that I have that piece of information from Hollywood and not from reality. That's 100% true. But I'm also wondering, were the decks big enough to fit all of the passengers? Because if they were, you'd think then every passenger would want to be up and on deck rather than inside, right?
I'm assuming they felt that initial impact, right, of the iceberg. But then when nothing immediately happened, I think a lot of people were like, oh, it's probably okay. And then they weren't told to abandon ship. So I think that there were probably some people that didn't know until very, very late in the process that anything was wrong. I'm sure they knew when the ship broke in half, right? But at that point, it's way too late.
When it started to list so dramatically. Yeah, or I guess it's not list if it's going bow first, but Thank you so much for telling me that awesome story.
You're welcome. There's just some weird details about this story. It's very odd. Let's get weird.
The unofficial tagline.
Well, thank you all so much for listening. We'll be back with another episode shortly. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Testing. Great.
Thank you for listening to It Chooses You. Your hosts are Teresa Sparks and Claire Patton. Our theme song is by Bobby Dart. If you'd like to get in touch with us, drop us an email at itchoosesyoupodcast@gmail.com.